I'm also going to follow the sort of instructions I received and talk entirely about the past, and particularly about the interplay between the diaspora, institutions, life, and the development of Ukrainian studies. And I'm going to use my own career path as the example of how these things evolved, or there's an interplay, and it should illustrate many of the points brought out again, both of the problems of doing Ukrainian studies, as well as to what extent the community was an asset in developing these studies. So like many of my colleagues, I grew up in really two parallel universes, the Ukrainian and American, which became linked and intertwined. I grew up in Philadelphia in a Ukrainian family. My parents were not part of some sort of intelligentsia. My father was a cabinet maker, my mother a seamstress and homemaker. No one in my family had any university education. I participated in the usual community activities in Philadelphia, and that included Ukrainian Saturday School, Plast, endless concerts, commemorations, academy, and so on. At the same time, I went to American schools. I had American friends and attended American sports events, concerts, and so on. So you really live in two parallel universes all the time. I went to college locally, LaSalle College, now LaSalle University. It was a feeder school for the Catholic school system in Philadelphia, but as many of these small Catholic colleges, it provided surprisingly good basic arts education, liberal arts. LaSalle had a second plus. Like many of the small colleges, it absorbed some of the many European academics displaced after World War II and who could not get employment in the major universities. At LaSalle, they had John Lukács, a Hungarian who was writing a book a year, and became quite famous actually, and more importantly for me, Ivan Leszak-Rudnitsky, who of course subsequently taught here at this university. By the time I graduated from LaSalle, there were still additional large contingents of Ukrainian professors. Leo Rudnitsky in literature, Miroslav Labunka in history, Eugene Lashchik in philosophy, and George Profetsky in language. Well, these instructors introduced me to new topics, ideas in Ukrainian studies. It was Ivan Leszak-Rudnitsky who introduced me to the works in Ukrainian history. I had no courses with him at LaSalle, because no course ever dealt with Ukraine there. But I took courses in European history with Ivan Leszak-Rudnitsky, with Lukács and others. However, Ivan Leszak-Rudnitsky invited me to his home, where for the first time I saw a huge library dedicated to Ukrainian history. He made me his teaching assistant, which was quite unusual, an undergraduate situation, but which really meant that I was grading his other students, so he didn't have to grade. And I would correct these student exam. But Ivan Rudnitsky also introduced me into a Ukrainian intellectual world in Philadelphia. It hovered around Rudnitsky and Ivan Kuropetsky, an economist at Temple University, and recruited several, I would say, generations of students pursuing graduate studies or trying to become literary figures. And in these, I would include Vsevolod Isayu, who at Toronto, Marta Borchowska-Chomiak, Orest Subtelny, Marko Tsarennik, Sonia Sluzer, who later edited Problems of Communism. This Philadelphia corps was supplemented with a New York contingent headed by Vsevolod Holubnichi and his wife, well-known economist. And also included Marta Borchowska-Chomiak, who was now doing her work at Columbia University, and her husband, Rostislav, who now became sort of New Yorkers. And the link between these two was Professor Kuropetsky and his wife, who lived in New Jersey and arranged these parties, soirees, whenever there was some interesting visitor, scholar, some poet, and so on in town. And the guests from New York and Philly would meet, since they could go meet halfway in New Jersey in Kuropetsky household. Now, the parallel Ukrainian sort of academic universe in Philly also extended to more formal institutions. In 1963, when I was just starting at LaSalle, the Lipinsky East European Research Institute was founded. It was the academic arm of the Hetmanate movement, Ukrainian monarchists. I think everyone here is aware. This is Hetman Skoropadsky was briefly Hetman of Ukraine in 1918, of the Ukrainian state, and these people followed, thought that monarchism was the real arm or the future of Ukraine. The institute boasted having the archive of Hetman Pawlo Skoropadsky, who also had papers of their patron, Vyacheslav Lipinsky, another very important figure, both as a historian, sociologist, but also an ideologist of the Hetmanite movement. Well, Ivan Rudnitsky got me involved in that because Ivan Rudnitsky was a monarchist, a Hetmanite. And I was helping to issue English language leaflets for that. And through the Lipinsky Institute, I also met Professor Yaroslav Pelensky and Maxim Pezur, historian and political scientist, who would take their summers off and work at that institute while in the regular year teaching at their university. At the same time that I was engaged in the parallel Ukrainian community and academic life, I was participating in the normal American academic life after obtaining my a Woodrow Wilson scholarship. I was actually recruited by a number of universities for graduate studies, and for a variety of reasons, I chose the University of Pennsylvania, which was also in Philadelphia. At that time, Penn had two sort of Russian historians. That's Alexander Rozanovsky in the early Russia history period, and Alfred J. Reber for modern Russia. Before I left Penn, we already had Moshe Lewin, who was added for Soviet history, which was just at that time coming in as a field. Also had this rather distinguished Czech historian Otakar Odležílek, who was covering East Central Europe. My progress was pretty much normal in coursework, general exams, and then came thesis time. In one of my seminars with Reber, I produced a large work at the beginning of modern Ukrainian political thought, and in the 19th century. And one of the elements of this was the role of this Cossack autonomy literature, such as Istoria Rusiu and other things. Soon I ended up in 18th century studies and my thesis on the abolition of Ukrainian autonomy. Somehow Reber looked favorably on such a topic. Maybe he was afraid that if I had a more modern topic, my nationalism would come out. This seemed safer or something. But nevertheless, I was moving that. But then, how can one do this at the University of Pennsylvania? Not a single faculty member knew anything about the topic, and the Penn Library did not have the resources to support such a research project. And it is this time the Harvard project was just beginning. The chairs were not yet founded, but a program has been initiated by Professor Pritsak. And Professor Reber allowed me to explore the possibility of engaging Harvard into my research project. At the same time, Professor Pritsak was searching for students, really disciples. You really had to be a disciple of his project that would be practitioner of the newly revised Ukrainian studies he was promoting. With my arrival at Harvard in the late 1969, I was thrust fully into the Harvard project, from coursework to fundraising. For the first time, I took courses on a university level on Ukrainian history with Professor Pritsak, and more importantly for me, Professor Alexander Ohloblin, who at this time would be the leading authority on Cossack Ukraine anywhere, including Soviet Ukraine. I became first secretary of the seminar in Ukrainian studies held at Harvard University and editor of its minutes, and then also editor-chief of Recensia, review of Soviet Ukrainian publications in 1973-74. These years at Harvard were absolutely formative for me. And at Penn, I became a historian. But at Harvard, I became a historian of Ukraine. Thus, the Harvard project was very important. First of all, it legitimized my research interest, and it gave me a wherewithal to pursue it. During this time, I was gradually doing my dissertation work. It was proceeding rather slowly because of all the other things you were doing at Harvard at initiative of Professor Pritsak. My university was accommodating, was even appointed Professor Ohloblin as an additional thesis advisor. But everything didn't work out just so smoothly. As part of my research, I was supposed to go to Ukraine on the IREX exchange, International Research Exchanges Board, and accepted for this. 2 weeks before my trip, I was finally denied a visa to the Soviet Union. I was hardly shocked by this denial, but this brings out an important point. The ability of the Soviets to have shaped the field of Russian-Soviet studies in the United States by their ability to ultimately determine who goes and what topics could be studied. It was crucial that you have this first-hand experience to be really a legitimate scholar, to at least get to the first tier of universities. But if you have to then pick topics and things where you can do this kind of research over there, combined with the fact that Russian history was saturated by the students of Michael Karpovich of Harvard, who from the late 40s to early 50s produced a whole array of scholars. These two factors also made any breakthrough for Ukrainian studies very problematic. Okay, how much more? 1 minute. I will just mention one other thing that sort of illustrative. I was writing my thesis, producing chapters, and everything was going smoothly. Then my fifth chapter, so I was well into my thesis, on the Ukrainian reactions and aspiration of the Legislative Commission of 1767-1768, which was Catherine called as Legislative Commission. Various elements of societies were asked to write petitions about their needs and desires and so on. So this chapter was suddenly rejected and by my thesis committee, and the answer was that Alex Rezanowski had grave reservations about it and its nationalist approach. No example were given. I simply was told to rewrite the entire chapter. Okay, I mean, it was a very strange chapter to make a stand on, because it was a highly technical chapter and not a broad interpretive one. I mean, you had these points and from these people, and all accumulated and so on. So how to rewrite it? Well, I retyped some pages that had corrective whiteout on it. This is pre-computer age, and handed exactly the same chapter a year later. And the response from Professor Reber was that the rewritten chapter was like night and day. It was clear that what happened is that Alex Rezanowski, who is a scion of white Russian emigre family, could just not accept what was happening and attempted to slow down, if not stop, the process. I don't know whether he ever, Alex even looked at the rewrite. Okay, I will stop at this time, but it shows you both the problems and the great opportunities that came up with things like the Harvard Research Institute.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Then we covered